Hi, everyone. I'm Amara Jones, today the moderator of this exciting panel, the Alt-Right's Anti-Transgender Backlash, here to delve into a really important topic of the entire infrastructure and the way that we are experiencing the current backlash in across the country. I am the founder and creator of Translash, which is a trans journalism and storytelling project, which focuses on centering the stories and issues of trans people at a time of social backlash. Actually, next Thursday, August 20th, we will be launching a podcast, the Translash podcast. If you go to www.translash.org and sign up for our newsletter on Monday, you'll get all of the ways to be able to download and listen to that podcast. Our first guest will be Andrea Jenkins, who is the first ever Black trans woman elected to political office in the history of the United States. So I'm super excited about that. In terms of today's panel, we think that it's really timely because in 23 states across the country, there are legislatures that are currently considering anti-trans legislation. This anti-trans legislation overwhelmingly focuses on trans youth, specifically in the area of sports participation and also equal access to healthcare, as well as other issues. So in many ways, trans people and trans issues will be on the ballot this fall. But this rash of legislation, as well as a whole host of lawsuits which act as companions, aren't springing out of nowhere. They are the result of an entire ecosystem on the right that is designed to highlight and to move anti-trans legislation and issues across the country using a variety of tools that are not only political and legislative, but also judicial, media, and cultural as well. And all of those things fit together to lead us to this current moment. And that's why I'm thrilled to be able to unpack all of these really complicated issues, but not so complicated when you think about it, with three incredible people who spend their lives in these issues, who spend their lives focused on the ways in which trans communities are coming under attack in a coordinated way and work to end those attacks and that coordination. And the three guests that we have here today are, first up, Chase Strangio, who is the Deputy Director for Transgender Justice at the ACLU, also one of the legal masterminds of the case in June, which ruled at the court that LGBTQ people are protected from employment discrimination by the Civil Rights Act. And also the star, I don't know if star is the right word, Chase, of The Fight, which is a documentary about that case and about the way in which it all unfolded. Next up will be Heron Greensmith, who is the Senior Research Analyst at Policy Research Associates, where Heron monitors anti-trans rhetoric and organizations. And last but certainly not least is Brennan Suen, who is the LGBTQ Program Director at Media Matters, which monitors misinformation by conservatives across the spectrum of LGBTQ issues. I'll start out with a question for each of them so that we can kind of unpack this complicated universe. And then after that, to delve really quickly into your questions where we're sure that there's a lot of richness. I think one of the most important things to keep in mind is that the world that we're describing, many of the names that you'll hear, we are familiar in other areas other areas of anti-progressive movements on the right. And so you'll be able to see the overlapping between the way in which this ecosystem is anti-trans, but it's actually anti-progressive in so many ways. In many ways, it's the usual suspects. So first of all, thank you all three for joining us today. Really appreciate it. So first up, Chase, I'm wondering if you can just give us an overview of these 23 cases. I'm sorry, these 23, because you're a lawyer, but if you can give us an overview of what's happening in these 23 states across the country, and also the way in which they tie into lawsuits that act as kind of parallel movements and the work of the Alliance Defending Freedom. Kind of what's the snapshot of what's going on, and then how do these cases kind of begin to swirl in these lawsuits that are pushed by ADF?
Yes, for sure. Thanks, Amara. And it's so good to be here. Even though I don't know how much I love talking about this because it's just a little bit bleak. I think it's really important because our opponents are so coordinated, and so we have to make visible the nature of the coordination and our efforts to combat it on multiple fronts. I think it's really important to sort of, I mean, we could go back a long period of time, but at least the last 5 years and look at sort of what happened post Obergefell, which was the marriage equality decision from the Supreme Court. And you can see sort of the anti-LGBTQ anti-reproductive justice groups sort of consolidating rhetoric around trans bodies and anti-trans discourse in the wake of the marriage equality decision. And one of the sort of pivotal moments was in November of 2015, right after the June 2015 decision from the Supreme Court. You had this fight in Houston, Texas on the ballot to repeal anti-discrimination protections that protected 15 classes of people under local law in Houston, which was the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance. The efforts to repeal that law, that ordinance, were entirely focused on situating the trans person as threat. So we saw then the sort of real coordinated consolidation of the narrative of the quote unquote man in the women's restroom, sort of the discourse of the trans person as threat. And they were incredibly successful in that, in part because our movement did not in any way fight back with a sort of centering trans people counter narrative. And so our opponents were able to gain a significant amount of momentum in November of 2015. And then what we saw in 2016 when state legislatures convened, and states come into legislative session at different times. Every state has a legislature. I sometimes want to be like, I didn't really understand even sort of how does Congress work and how do the states work. But states, we often lose sight of how important it is to focus on what's happening at the state and local level, because so much of the anti-trans work is happening in the states. And in 2016, we saw the rise of the anti-trans bill in state legislatures. It certainly wasn't the first time it appeared, but that was when we saw about 50 bills targeting trans youth, specifically in the context of schools and restrooms. And this was a coordinated effort, and Heron will talk about the different groups and sort of how they coordinate. But that was when we saw HB2 in North Carolina, HB 1523 in Mississippi. And those were the two that passed, but we saw so many laws targeting trans people in that legislative session. And actually a lot of the sort of leaders in the spaces at that time ended up becoming, players in the Trump administration after Trump is elected in 2016. So you have this trajectory where you have marriage equality and then the rise of the anti-trans bill in 2016. Trump is elected. State legislatures calmed down a little bit in 2017, 2018, and 2019 because there's so much power in the federal government. So you no longer have sort of the Obama administration taking comparatively progressive positions with respect to trans people's protections under federal civil rights laws. State legislatures are still pushing anti-trans bills during those years, but not as much as what we saw in 2016. Then, cut to 2020. And I think that one thing that happened was the right was unsuccessful largely in the anti-trans bathroom discourse. You had ballot initiatives fail in Washington, in Montana, in Anchorage, Alaska, and in Massachusetts. And people sort of who were proponents of those anti-trans policies sort of admitted that a lot of the rhetoric was completely contrived. It was clear that it wasn't gaining as much momentum. They were definitely not able to succeed at the ballot, and nor were they winning in court. However, they were seeing that when it came to other conversations about trans youth, specifically conversations that were more centrally focused on the body. And again, this is where I think we can locate some blame ourselves when our counter narrative in the bathroom was very much, you're not going to see anyone naked. Don't worry, there's all this privacy in the bathroom, and not so much the trans body is not in and of itself a threat. We could have gone in that direction, and we didn't. And so now 2020, you sort of have a real effective strategic tactical shift to the body. And that we are seeing in two primary ways in state legislatures. The first is in sports. And so this is where we're seeing bills proposed to ban trans people from sports that match, who we are. That was definitely a dominant discourse in the Equality Act conversations in Congress, the bill that would expand civil rights protections explicitly under federal law, not only for LGBTQ people, but also expand protections for everyone. The Republican focus in the congressional committees was almost entirely on sports, particularly in the House Judiciary Committee, in part because they were able to gain, so liberal, whatever that means, allies in the conversation. Martina Navratilova, others sort of jumping in the anti-trans conversation, saying that, women and girls who are trans are a threat to women's sports. And so we saw many bills in state legislatures in 2020 focused on that. And then the other site was in the context of medical care for trans youth. And this was really a newer area, and sort of you can see it coming off of the anti-abortion playbook, where the proposals were to actively criminalize or otherwise civilly punish medical providers, and in some cases parents and school administrators, for supporting trans youth and in accessing medical care. And many of these were, went so far as to be felony bans on healthcare for trans minors. And again, this had to do with sort of the body of trans people. You can trace it to this, highly contested and custody battle in Texas that the right-wing media sort of picked up on in very strategic ways. And again, you can see the intersection between the media, the sort of policy organizing and coordination among far-right groups, and then sort of the litigation groups also taking positions in court. And so you have these multiple threads that led to the proliferation of anti-trans bills in the 2020 legislative sessions. Now, the 2020 legislative sessions also took place at the time that the COVID pandemic started to pick up. So what ended up happening is you had bills, proposed in 17 bills on sports and about 15 on healthcare, and only Idaho ended up passing a ban. So Idaho passed 2 anti-trans bills at the start of COVID, but a lot of other states ended up adjourning their legislative sessions, which was very bad for some reasons, but also very good for some of these reasons, because we didn't end up having these anti-trans bills pass in 2020, though I think it's very likely that we're going to see, particularly depending on what happens with the presidential election, a resurgence of these bills in 2021. And then just to sort of shift in terms of what's going on in the courts. So you have 2 threads of litigation in the courts as well. You have sort of our litigation challenging the bad policies. So, the ACLU sued Idaho for their anti-trans bill that was a sweeping ban on trans participation in sports. Lambda sued Idaho over their anti-trans bill that restricted access to updated identification, birth certificates in this context. So there's those threads, and there's still pending cases, like Gavin Grimm's case. There's a case out of Florida that's going up in the courts on sort of restrictive policies at the local school district level, denying access to restrooms for trans people. There's also the sort of incredibly insidious new brand of litigation that's primarily filed by ADF and like groups that are challenging good policies. So particularly in the context of sports, you have ADF representing cisgender girls suing the state of Connecticut and school districts in Connecticut for a trans inclusive policy. These lawsuits are incredibly dangerous because not only do they sort of take the position that trans people aren't covered under federal or state law, but that it would be illegal to protect us. And so just the consequences of that would be if a court were to rule in ADF's favor, particularly if they were to do so on constitutional grounds, it would essentially nullify state and local protections. And that's the end game for them. They want courts to rule that it is against the law to protect trans people. And they've, put forth a number of lawsuits. In their lawsuits, we intervene. So we're parties in their Connecticut lawsuit on behalf of the transgender young women that they're targeting. In our lawsuits, they intervene on behalf of cisgender girls. And so this is becoming, this incredibly contested terrain of, in the sports context, trans girls versus cis girls, which is exactly how they want it, even though the reality is that, by and large, non-trans girls are incredibly supportive of their trans teammates. I think ADF and other groups have been incredibly effective at situating the trans body as sort of a threat to the cis body, and that's been very much a theme in the litigation. One other thing I'll flag, and then I'll turn it over, or we'll move on, is that the other sort of thing that's playing out in all of these is that they've also, sort of effectively weaponized the First Amendment to argue that there is a First Amendment protection to not be forced to use the right pronoun for trans people. So there's state bills that are sort of, a lot of the criminal bans on healthcare also have a section that tries to restrict the ability of schools to require affirmation of youth, including in the context of pronouns. There are lawsuits over, professors who have been fired for not using the right pronoun. And then in our Connecticut lawsuit, the judge instructed ADF to not refer to our clients as males. It was an incredibly innocuous instruction. He said you can refer to them as biological males, you can refer to them as transgender women, you can refer to them as transgender athletes, but you just can't say males, period. And they sought to disqualify the judge on First Amendment and other grounds, and have actually gone up to an appeals court seeking mandamus, which is incredibly sort of exceptional form of relief to disqualify the judge based on that instruction. So we're seeing that as sort of a subtext in a lot of the litigation too, how does language operate? So there's a lot going on in this space. I think it also extends so far beyond sport, because what this is really about is sort of that sort of categorization of sex and sort of how the law is going to exclude people from different categories, and what is that going to mean in different contexts. And our opponents are incredibly skillful and strategic, and so we have to be ready to fight on multiple fronts.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that it's really important to note just a couple of things. One, this weaponization of the body is a theme that they're using not only in these state legislative movements, but also with respect to these lawsuits, right? So it's kind of the same thing. It's also important that while Idaho, laws that when we say 23 states, it's various stages of the legislative process. So some of these have been introduced, some of these are in committee, some of these are coming up for a vote. So even though Idaho was unsuccessful, there's still a pipeline that is still behind. So I just want people to realize that even though there is a lack of success there, that doesn't mean that it's done, right? It's far from that. And then thirdly, the way in which these legislative bills kind of echo and take their cue from a lot of the language and the positioning in these lawsuits, right? That, they use kind of what's happening on the legal front in part as a guiding light for how to move forward. And so I think that that's really important that you framed the ADF approach in all of this, which is the Alliance Defending Freedom. It's a right-wing group that basically sees itself as promoting, the United States as a Christian nation and advancing a whole host of things, including anti-trans and what I would say anti-women legislation across the country as well. So thank you for that, and thank you for what you do. Heron, I'm wondering if you can just take the journey a little forward. Heron, not Brennan. Let's see, is Heron still there?
I'm here, hi.
Okay, hi. Take the journey a little forward for us. So can you talk about, we know that we've heard about how these lawsuits kind of are working at the state level, how they're targeting the issues of trans youth, and the way in which some of the state legislative laws kind of take their cues from that. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how some of these laws are getting introduced and the organizations behind that, namely the Family Research Council and their policy arm, and then also how those then can sometimes then filter from what's happening at the state level to the national organizations like the Heritage Foundation and others. So how there's this other pipeline from local to state through these two institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much, Amara, for having me here today and having all of us. This is an incredibly important and prescient conversation. As Amara says, I'm Heron Greensmith. I'm the senior research analyst for LGBTQI justice at Political Research Associates, where we research the right and build capacity among partner organizations and networks to help create a feminist, queer, inclusive, multiracial democracy. I focus much of my work on monitoring and analyzing anti-trans actors here in the US, right now largely anti-trans feminists, so-called gender-critical networks, and the broader Christian right, who leverage their voices to create the impression of a broader base of support for anti-trans advocacy than actually exists. I also look at conversion therapy networks, the interlock between white supremacy and child welfare, the leaders and rhetoric of anti-sex work, feminism, and I also convene a global group of researchers monitoring the spread of anti-gender ideology rhetoric. But like Amara said, we're here to focus today on the organizations and networks, the leaders, and the rhetoric attacking trans folks in the US. I'm going to address 3 areas of specific concern, and I hope you'll follow the work of PRA, of Media Matters with Brennan Sun, and with the Southern Poverty Law Center as well, who are all doing similar work to mine, connecting, you know, every facet of anti-trans advocacy right now, from your, gender critical parent on the ground who gets connected to these gender crit groups who are then platformed by the Heritage Foundation, for example, who then get hooked into testifying for or against legislation, as the case may be, and then, essentially create the petri dish that allows cases like the case in Connecticut to come forward. First, I'm going to talk a bit about the groups and orgs that we're all familiar with, the well-funded Christian right organizations who lead the anti-trans litigation and legislation around the country right now. Second, the gender critical parents groups who are emboldening legislatures like Fred Deutsch in South Dakota. And then thirdly, the Women's Liberation Front and other anti-trans feminists here in the US. So first, let's talk about the big kids. Of course, Chase referred to Alliance Defending Freedom, the organization behind so many of the cases attacking the justice and dignity of trans folks right now. ADF represents Selena Soul in her case against Connecticut. They represent the cis students suing over their Pennsylvania school district's trans-inclusive non-discrimination policy in Dover Boyertown, and they're now intervening, like Chase said, in Hecox v. Little, the ACLU's case to overturn Idaho's sports ban. I linked all of those in the comments. If you can't see them, I hope that the admin can help out, but the case pages for all those are in the chat right now. And that's to mention only a very small fraction of the recent litigation against the dignity and justice for trans youth in particular. But, as Chase said, and as this points out, like ADF is a juggernaut, right? They are a, multi-million dollar, I think it's like $58 million funded organization. They have an incredible network of Blackstone fellows and allied attorneys all across the country and even the world. And they have the money and the position and the ear and the eye of federal and state administrative folks and legislators to bring these cases right now. For example, let's talk a little bit about Barbara Ehart. She was the lead sponsor of the anti-trans sports bill in Idaho. On a webinar that I attended with the anti-trans feminist org Save Women's Sports, Barbara Ehart stated outright that she had contacted Matt Sharp at ADF when she was ready to draft the bill. I've had quite a few folks asking me recently if I know who's behind the anti-trans legislation and litigation popping up this year. I've been asked if there's secret meetings, and as Chase said, there's no mystery here. We don't need to look for secret meetings. These are all the same players who have been pushing all the anti-trans lawsuits and bills for the past 5 years. The same folks who've been attacking abortion rights, who've been attacking contraception, who have been attacking parental rights for the past 30, 40 years. I'm sure they have coalition meetings just like we do, but we don't need to look for the secret cabal. The cabal is not secret. It's the ADF, it's the Family Policy Alliance, who are this, the former policy arm of FRC, who now convene and join together these family policy organizations across the United States. For example, the Massachusetts Family Institute, who are, worked really, really hard against, worked, I guess, for the trans public accommodations bill here in Massachusetts. I'm glad that I don't remember which side is the bad side anymore because we won. But now they're actually pushing to reopen schools here in Massachusetts. It's a generally conservative organization who loves to attack trans kids. Like the Family Research Council, who are an enormous organization who essentially runs the policy, kind of like the think tank side of the Christian right. Of course, ADF, Family Policy Alliance, Family Research Council, Heritage, the Beckett Fund, I'm sure they have coalition meetings, like we do. In fact, FRC runs a Values Voter Conference every year. In 2017, Peter Montgomery with Right Wing Watch, whom I also recommend everyone subscribe to right now on every form of media, was there at FRC's Values Voter Summit when Meg Kilgannon, she's an anti-trans mom with Hands Across the Aisle and concerned parents and educators of Fairfax County, when she outlined the tactics the parents should use in their school districts to attack trans-inclusive policies. And I'm going to raise up two here. First, focusing on gender identity to divide and conquer. And second, partnering with anti-trans feminists to avoid outright faith-based arguments in favor of secular arguments to activate a broader audience. And I also want to point folks towards Project Blitz. Project Blitz playbook was created by the Congressional Player Caucus. They have a three-part plan towards Christian nationalism, including the passage of innocuous religious heritage resolutions, which then smooth the way towards religious history and freedom bills that enshrine a state's understanding that sex is binary, for example, that sex is correctly assigned at birth. And that second part culminates in the third part in legislation that permits and encourages outright discrimination against trans folks, against LGBTQ families, and against pregnant people, among others. There's no mystery. They're not hiding their work. They might be hiding their associations with the administrations around the country, but we have that data too. Back to Meg Kilgannon, again at Values Voter. I wanted to go briefly over the gender critical parents organizations like hers who are giving these larger national organizations the cover they need. Representative Fred Deutsch from South Dakota said that he was inspired to propose his anti-trans legislation that would have barred parents and doctors and trans kids from seeking trans-affirming care. He was inspired when he saw parents from the Kelsey Coalition talking at the Heritage Foundation and then later on Twitter. The Kelsey Coalition was a group of supposedly concerned parents of children who are trans and gender nonconforming. Color me skeptical. The group was first introduced at the Heritage Foundation, was responsible for some pretty gross anti-trans op-eds across the country in major newspapers, likely placed with the help of Heritage Foundation and others. And as of early spring is now defunct, having been effective in their mission. The Kelsey Coalition was one of several new organizations here in the US modeled after successful UK orgs like Fourth Wave Now, Transgender Trend, organizations purporting to network anti-trans or so-called gender critical parents with one another and with the resources they need to advocate against trans equality in their kids' schools. I wrote recently in Teen Vogue about one such online resource called the Gender Critical Parents Board, on which parents are sharing the names and contact information of conversion therapists across the US, Canada, and the UK. I finally wanted to close out talking about anti-trans feminist groups participating in these networks, particularly here in the US, the Women's Liberation Front, who is partnered directly with Alliance Defending Freedom, Family Policy Alliance, and Concerned Women for America, and has spoken at the Heritage Foundation and the Family Research Council's Values Voter Summit. These organizations, Women's Liberation Front and the Evangelical Right, are strategically partnering to give anti-trans legislation, regulation, and litigation the veneer of a broader base of support than it actually has. WOLF members are regulars on the anti-trans athlete circuit. They were called in from out of state to testify on behalf of the heinous South Dakota anti-trans affirming care bills. Women's Liberation Front and Concerned Women for America co-organized the rally outside of the Supreme Court on the day of the Bostock oral arguments. I'm sure some of you have seen the Housing and Urban Development rule that came out in July, the final rule permitting, maybe it's proposed, Chase can confirm that, permitting-
It's not final, but.
Awesome. Submit comments now, regulations.gov. In the proposed rule permitting anti-violence and homelessness orgs to explicitly discriminate against trans women and gender nonconforming people, HUD cites to an HHS document, Health and Human Services document on intimate partner violence. But what they actually cited to was Wolf's citation of the Health and Human Services document, which deliberately misinterprets the statistics to imply that trans women are the perpetrators of violence rather than overwhelmingly the survivors of said violence. Yes, that is HUD citing to anti-trans feminists' interpretation of HHS data. In some Anti-trans right is using money, media, and strategic voices to bolster its campaigns. There's no mystery, there's no hidden agenda. Anti-trans policies are helping the Christian right consolidate resources, consolidate power, and therefore further Christian nationalism here in the US. I am so sorry. I am quadruple booked this weekend for conferences. I'm going to have to leave in about 15 minutes. I'm so grateful to Amara and to my fellow panelists for the incredible work that they do. Please follow PRA, follow Media Matters, follow SPLC, follow ACLU, follow Lambda, follow Translash, and let's fight back against this shit. Thank you, Amara.
Thank you. Thank you so much for framing all of that. And it leads us naturally to our conversation with Brennan of Media Matters. And Brennan, one of the things that we ended up with in Heron's description of what's happening is the way in which they, this move towards Christian nationalism focused on trans rights, uses these natural stories, quote unquote, that seem to be coming from everyday people, but are coordinated by all of the organizations that we just mentioned. But that somehow gives a false impression through online resources, through the media, that there's kind of this both sides to this issue, and that both sides are equal in their concern for youth. And so I'm wondering if you can just talk about the way in which these stories are used and coordinated in larger media narratives, but then specifically kind of the online universe of YouTube and Facebook that's used to kind of amplify and drive this agenda in ways that people may not be aware.
Yeah, sounds great. Well, I mean, it sounds terrible, but
it's terrible.
You know what I mean? I'm happy to talk about it. Yeah, so I think that you raised a good question about, like, a good point about both sidesism. And I think one thing that I've really learned in my time as the LGBTQ program director at Media Matters is, like, there's a lot of things going on, but one of them is that the mainstream media, non-aligned media, cable news, outlets like New York Times, they're often, like, not really covering trans issues. Sometimes they don't do bad. I mean, if they do, then we engage with them. But one of the bigger problems is that they are not really engaging. Meanwhile, the right is obsessed with it. And I think there's many reasons. One, you know, the Christian right has a vested interest in dehumanizing trans people and the queer community overall. You know, not only is it a belief of theirs, but it is a way to amass power. It's a way to become an electoral issue as well. So they have really dedicated a lot of time to these topics. And so I think when you look at the broader picture, we've talked about, you know, connections to administration, the things administration's doing. We've been talking about legislation at the state level, and we've been talking about litigation. And these are all really strong ways to amass power, you know, through policy change. But they also, as part of that, need to get public opinion change. And how do they do that? Primarily through the media. There's also a bit of a church component to it as well. But I would say, you know, in my opinion, the media is one of the biggest and scariest ways that they are doing this. And you know, so I said that the mainstream media is not always covering this. The right wing, the Christian right, and these groups like ADF, they actually, like, benefit a lot from bypassing, you know, mainstream media. So maybe 10 years ago, if you wanted to change hearts and minds, you might go on a Sunday show on one of the major networks and talk about an issue. But that opens you up to getting credible questions and reporter pushback. And now they don't have to do that. I mean, ADF almost exclusively appears on Fox, for instance. A lot of the figures from the Heritage Foundation are showing up on Fox. People from Kelsey Coalition Parents, which Heron was talking about, go on Fox. And they can go and basically use this as a very, very powerful extended communications shop to push their ideology. And they're not going to get much pushback. And the other benefit to going to these areas is that they are extremely highly engaged with. So Fox's primetime lineup is just, like, smashing records. Right now, they are constantly ahead of the other networks in their viewership. So, you know, I think that the calculus has been, we don't really need to go anywhere besides outlets like this. And Fox News, I think you should think of really in two ways. You have their opinion folks. You should think of it in one way, but split. So they have what they call their opinion folks and what they call their news folks. The news folks are really just opinion people trying to give credibility to their people who they state are opinion. So you have people like Shannon Bream, who has a show at 11, I think, who will bring on people from ADF, help kind of create this Christian persecution narrative. I think if you haven't been following Fox as much as I have, which I really honestly hope you haven't, you at least have heard of the war on Christmas. I think that's kind of emblematic of this like Christian persecution narrative that goes on the right. If LGBTQ people, if trans people get rights, then Christians are going to be, and white Christians honestly, are going to be having their rights taken away. So you'll have people like Shannon Bream, but you also have Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham, who are completely obsessed with trans bodies, going off and really just spreading vitriol and misinformation. And as Chase talked about, the two big topics that we've been seeing escalating in the last few years that have been really successful are the trans athletes and best practice care for trans youth. And I think that it is a natural evolution of their, you know, of the messaging around the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance. It's this false perception that trans people are dangerous. They are going to harm your daughters. A lot of times it's actually interesting, this is something that they'd actually want. They conjure images of a trans boy, a trans man wrestling with cisgender women, which is actually the policy that they ask for, but they create this perception that, oh, if you know, your daughter is going to be beat up by a man in their language. And the hypocrisy is that they don't even, you know, think of a trans man as a man. So Fox News is a really important part of this apparatus, and they are extremely successful in reaching a lot of people. But what's even scarier in the last few years is what is going on online. And I will say I am a huge critic of Facebook. Facebook is at the core of this problem online. You have outlets like Daily Wire and LifeSite News that constantly just own the entire share of conversations around trans rights. Media Matters did a study looking at viral trans-related content, and we found that more than half of the content that was getting over 100,000 interactions on Facebook, which are likes, comments, shares, those were coming from right-leaning sources. And what were they about? They were about best practice medical care, and they were about trans athletes, and very specifically often about ADF's trans athlete or cases against trans athletes. So through this, they're able to reach a lot of people. And what makes this the most scary is that a lot of Americans don't know a trans person. And that's why representation in media is so important. That's why we're seeing a really big moment with shows like Pose, documentaries like Disclosure, and you know, a lot of other really amazing moments of representation. But a lot of people aren't watching those who are going to be susceptible to misinformation on Facebook. So they're getting their information on Facebook. More than half of Americans, according to a Pew Research study, are getting their information, getting news from Facebook. And Facebook has just like, similar to Fox News, there's something about like fear-mongering, hateful, bigoted content that people get addicted to. And Facebook's algorithm benefits that. Facebook's algorithm, they make money by anti-trans content going viral. I mean, they are consistently getting more interactions and creating these news cycles that have real world results. So Chase mentioned earlier a custody battle in Texas. So in October of last year, right-wing media went, you know, they just went wild with publishing content, starting Twitter hashtags, posting content on Facebook, and they got a ton of people to engage with these stories. And then what happened from there, you get an outraged public. Two Congress people started to weigh in, Ted Cruz and Dan Crenshaw, who are Congress people out of Texas. And they started tweeting a hashtag that the Daily Wire had been tweeting using this young person's dead name. And again, it's crucial to think that this is a 6-year-old kid and her mother that are at the center of this. And the next thing you know, Texas is launching an investigation. We're seeing a slate of anti-trans bills about accessing best practice care. And again, this is all based on a false premise that this young person is going to be getting surgery, which is what the entire debate was around, which is not something that would be remotely considered for several years and several, other steps, including a social transition. That makes it onto Fox News. It makes it into policy. The groups are, litigating over it. They're helping craft policy, and people are clicking on it. And so I think it's really important to think about media as part of this apparatus that helps the right amass power. I think that's a good overview of kind of those two ecosystems. And I'm happy to turn it back to Amara.
Yeah, thank you so much. We had to lose Heron, unfortunately, but we're glad that you all can be here. We're asking now for any questions that you might have. Hopefully there were lots of notes or ideas that came to you and that you took and that you want to share with us so that we can open up the conversation. I think as people, it's always a lack for people to actually ask their questions. So as everyone prepares for asking our panelists whatever came to you during this talk. Chase, I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about, we've given kind of the overview, the institutional impact of all of these various institutions, but one of the ones that Heron spoke about, which is specifically TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists who, say that they're for women's rights, but are a part of this mix of people who have joined with the Christian right to advance anti-trans legislation and policy across the country. You've been a particular target of them. And I'm wondering if you can just talk about, as an individual, what it is like to be the focus of these groups and kind of what the tenor of their approach and conversation and the personal impact of that. Because I don't think, we were very institutional, but these are real people impacting other people's lives, and TERFs are a big part of that. And you've had a personal experience with them in terms of the way that they target you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, as Heron mentioned, I think one of the really insidious things about sort of this trans exclusionary discourse and the so-called gender critical feminists is sort of how they do create this like veneer of legitimacy around their hate and how they escalate in social media spaces very deliberately align with the sort of alt-right media, but then they use that to target individuals, and I think because because I have a platform and I focus on trans work, definitely, at least as to my Twitter, there's just a sort of constant influx of anti-trans commentary that comes through, and then it sort of goes into this sort of underground media space that then comes back to me personally on all my platforms, and then also targets my employer. There's often like petitions to have me fired, petitions to have other people fired for engaging with me. So like there was a petition to have Chris Hayes fired from MSNBC because he had me on his podcast. There's just like constant commentary on my appearance, on my my efforts to sort of groom trans youth into transness. So I think that there are all these ways that it ends up sort of just like impeding my psychic space, because even though I'm not like reading it, it's just like coming at me in all these different directions. And then there's like a Federalist headline or a Breitbart headline, like ACLU lawyer says, even if I'm just like existing and not speaking for the ACLU, there's definitely like efforts to try to sort of get the ACLU to retaliate against me. I think was a really common tactic to try to get people's employers to punish them. And it's one thing to do it to me because, you know, it's my job, I'm paid, you know, I have all these sort of, at least in theory, like institutional supports. I think the hard thing is, like, if you look at our clients, so for example, our clients in Connecticut, these two young women runners, you know, their entire high school careers of just existing in their teenage years has been sort of also the focus of this level of attack, everything that they do. And these are these two young Black women who have to live in a world already that is positioning them to be the subject of so much violence and discrimination, and then to have their sort of, even their small bits of joy sort of monopolized in the entire right wing, you know, turf sphere, plus the sort of Fox News sphere. I think, you know, that is just an unbelievable amount of pain and sort of emotional trauma to have to manage as a young person who's not being paid to do the work, who's just trying to live life. And so I think about, you know, if I'm getting this level of attack and sort of it's having this toll on me that I don't even necessarily know how to sort of account for, what does that mean for the young people? What does it mean for the young person in Texas who's trying to just exist and whose parents are having this custody dispute? What does it mean for the young people in South Dakota who are trying to just live and their lawmakers are targeting them, and these, you know, so-called feminists are coming in? And I think the important thing too there is sort of to look at the way who they align with. You know, at the Supreme Court, they weighed in to sort of have the court say that LGBTQ people aren't protected under federal law, aligning themselves with anti-abortion groups, you know, reproductive choice groups in general, and then claiming that they're for all women, except, you know, and with the exclusion of trans people who they don't consider women. All trans people, by the way. It's like definitely trans women, but they're like also like don't know what to do with trans masculine people at all either. And so like every time they get mad at me, they're like, oh, you're mansplaining me, but also you're a woman. So it's, there's just like so much vitriol and not a lot of coherence, but the coherence isn't aligning with a very powerful set of people who are harming a lot of groups that they purport to care about. And the personal attacks are really insidious and really hard to sort of manage. And then you start to see why trans people aren't going to put themselves out there, because this is the consequence of it. So
Right.
We really need to continue to sort of fight back, because they have a very well coordinated network.
Right.
And it looks like we have some questions now.
Yeah, we have several questions. So 4 questions now. So let's get to those. And given the time that we have left, let's try to keep our answers as concise as possible so that we can get to all of the questions that are here. The first question is from Tommy Yap, who asks, I guess, Brennan, this is a question for you. How does the mainstream media cover trans issues without giving a platform to those against? How do we prevent them from being elevated to a legitimate other side of the coin? How can people cover this in a good way?
That's a great question. I think there's several answers. One is to cover the wide swath of trans experience and existence, not just when trans people are dying, or not just when they are at the center of legislation or a case. And another thing to do is to not include them if you don't need to, and a lot of times you really are not going to need them. There's a tough reality though. If ADF is litigating a case at the Supreme Court, or if a lawmaker is trying to pass legislation, it's going to be hard for a journalist to ignore them. So I think there's a few things that they need to be doing. One, they need to be leading with accurate information and debunking misinformation, or not including the misinformation that these right-wing actors are putting out there. Two, there's contextualizing their associations, past extremism. So you can't just say this lawmaker is putting in this bill because he thinks that women are at risk. You need to find the other anti-trans things that this lawmaker has said, the people that they have worked with, and really show the broader picture and not just take them at face value if you do have to include them. And I think that that is really crucial, and in some ways a benefit to us, because if you can really show their extremism, you can show the real intent behind these bills. And I think that is one thing that the right is very good at. They're very two-faced. Like they'll go to a reporter at a state paper and, you know, say one thing, and then on their radio show they're saying something completely different and completely, you know, more obviously bigoted, less coded. So those are a few of the answers. There's more, but I'm gonna end there.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Sophie Kazub asked, and if I pronounce your last name wrongly, please forgive me, a really important question, which is, what's the likelihood that the Christian right takes it's cues from what's going on in Poland, such as their declaration of LGBT-free localities and all the rest of it. I mean, I think Heron touched on the fact that certain organizations like ADF actually have lawyers and links around the world. And we do know that in other right-wing movements, that those movements are global and that they do communicate. But I don't know if any of you have specific thoughts about this.
I mean, so I guess two quick things. Definitely there is a global movement sort of challenging. You can see it like sort of emerging specifically in places with the rise of a fascist government, Brazil, in Eastern Europe, in the United States, and other places in Latin America. And so it's definitely coordinated. I think, you know, looking at the courts is going to be, you know, critical. Like the Supreme Court sort of already held in Romer v. Evans that sort of state laws attempting to ban protections for LGBT people in sort of sweeping animus-driven ways are not constitutional. I think what the playbook is now in terms of the sort of, you know, what we're seeing in the anti-trans strategy in the courts is to create a constitutional right not to share space with trans people. And that's going to be, that is the agenda. And it would in effect undermine the ability of any jurisdiction of any kind, whether it's a school district or a city or a state, to protect trans people in any sort of meaningful and full way. That's the end game. You know, it's grounded in this privacy right that the Christian right is developing. The irony, of course, is that these same groups have argued for the last, you know, 50 years that there is no such thing as a privacy right in the Constitution in their efforts to erode abortion access, but they are hypocritical, and we know that. And one of the other questions was about the Fulton case. So next term at the Supreme Court, there's a case involving a question about the ability of the government, you know, whether the government has to contract with entities that discriminate, and this is in the context of child welfare and discrimination against, you know, LGBTQ families. But I think in general, we are going to see the anti-trans discourse figuring into the religious exemption conversation at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is very apt to cut into civil rights protections through religion. We are going to see these attacks over and over and over, whether it's, you know, Masterpiece Cake Shop case, now it's going to be Fulton, and the court is positioned to create a sweeping discriminatory rule that will impact everyone in all civil rights laws. And so I think we just have to stay really vigilant, because it, just like you see in the abortion context, it's the chipping away at the protections that happen over time that make them, they're already limited, and making them more and more limited, particularly for people who are more vulnerable and marginalized to systemic discrimination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that you referenced this already, but were you referring to this Philadelphia adoption case?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's a it's called Fulton versus City of Philadelphia. It's being briefed right now. It will be argued in the fall.
Okay, so Alex, that's the answer to your question. And then Nikki Ramirez asks, could any of the panelists speak to the importance of preserving and growing the ecosystem of LGBTQ media outlets and journalism and pushing back anti-trans narratives? I mean, that's what I do. And I think that it's essential. I think that, for instance, we wouldn't be having this conversation if it wasn't for a trans journalist being like, there seems to be a pattern here of the way in which these things are unfolding. Usually when you see movements like this, they don't just come out of nowhere. They are coordinated, and then start digging around and finding out that there's all this amazing research on this particular issue, and that there is actually a there. And so I honestly think that for so many reasons that mainstream media outlets, mainly because trans people aren't in newsrooms, and we are not only not in newsrooms, but not in charge of newsrooms, that developing our own outlets to spotlight and push and frame these issues are incredibly important. But I know both of you also have strong opinions about this. So Anne, what do you think about the importance of our own media outlets in driving back these issues?
Yeah, one thing I would say, you know, we actually at Media Matters put hard data to this when we were looking at trans-related content that on Facebook. And what we found is, though right-wing media had almost double of all of the other kinds of outlets combined, queer media had a very strong place in there. It was considerably more than non-aligned media or left-leaning media. And queer media is really like getting out good and accurate information. And it's also representative. Like, I think people in a lot of mainstream outlets are a little bit afraid to get it wrong, and they're also strapped for resources. And queer media, you know, sometimes they get it wrong, but most of the time they get it right because they have people in the newsroom who know what the issues are and who are affected by them. And I think it's really important to note that over the last few years, queer media has been decimated. We have lost really incredible outlets, are on the cusp of, like Into, for instance, we're at the cusp of losing others. You know, they're bleeding staff. And I think it's really, really important that we find ways to keep sharing their work, to keep lifting them up, and supporting them in whatever ways that we can, because without a robust queer media, then we will completely cede the narrative to the right. We will have almost nothing.
That's
And
right.
yeah, and just to add, I mean, I think it's so important to have trans people leading some of these conversations, because the deep sort of cis normative lens that trans people are viewed through creates this constant sort of reification of the trans story as being one where someone's true gender is always that which was assigned to them at birth. Like the quest for the old photos, the quest for like the pre-transition narrative. I mean, I can't even as a quote unquote expert speaking on trans law, I'm often asked for like, what would, you know, things about myself in the past, and sort of situating me as sort of like an inauthentic person, which is so much how all trans people are seen as subjects. And so if we don't sort of shift the lens out of the cis lens, I think we're going to continue to see that reification of sort of the trans person as fraudulent, whether or not, even in the sort of quote unquote progressive outlets, we constantly see those tropes coming up. And it's so important, you know, like the work Amara is doing is essential, because we need a trans lens to be guiding the trans story.
Yeah. So this has been a tough conversation. I'm wondering though, in the last 5 minutes, if we can actually leave people with a sense of hope or things that they can do. All of you all spoke about how hard these issues are and how much, you know, it takes out of you professionally and personally in challenging, but I'm wondering, what are you hopeful about in terms of where we are, and what can people do?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing a lot of scary stuff and a lot of pushback, and particularly in the media and the public lens. And that's because other forms of media are really starting to tell trans stories, to tell queer stories. And a lot more people are coming out, and a lot more people are meeting and knowing and loving trans people. And so I think that as scary as the reaction to this is, it is also responsive to a lot of good things. I mean, you can watch an episode of Pose or, you know, even like Sabrina, Disclosure, like, and just like cry your eyes out and just like love it. And that makes me happy to see. And as far as like an actionable step, this is like very specific, but like report people on Twitter for being anti-trans. Like they will, if they, like, Twitter has rules, they're not always well enforced, but if you know, Twitter is a hostile place for a lot of people. That people, you know, the right talks about First Amendment right and shutting down free speech. They are the ones shutting down free speech by harassing any person, particularly trans people, who speak out. So if you see that happening, like, report them, and Twitter will sometimes take down those posts and suspend them, and you'll get a little email saying this person's been kicked off for a week, and you're like, yeah, like that. So that's one step you can take.
Report trans phobes on Twitter.
Not trans folks, trans harassment.
No, I said trans phobes.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes, trans phobes, get them out.
Yeah, which, I mean, like this week we had sort of like two cover story. Like Janet was on the cover in this amazing piece by Kimberly Drew, and Hunter Schafer had a cover, and it was, you know, just sort of seeing trans people sort of shine in these sort of beautiful ways. You know, that, I mean, it gives you hope. I mean, I've known Hunter for a long time, I've known Janet for a long time, and then just sort of seeing the ways that things are shifting. So that gives me hope in terms of what, I mean, people can do. It also just like give people money. You know, we're in a time of crisis, our community's in crisis. You know, donate to mutual aid, you know, donate to GoFundMe, because the government's not taking care of us. We have to take care of ourselves. And in so doing, we're going to build power for our community to fight back. So I say give people cash.
And I would say one other thing, which is ACLU on their site has a map of all of the places where the various legislation is in various stages, from the committee level to being on the floor. I would urge you to go and see if your state is one of those, and to make your voice heard as a citizen, as that legislation moves or takes shape. I think that state legislatures rarely, electors rarely hear from individuals and people. And so if you, call and express your concern to your local representative about this, it would probably be much more impactful than you can know. So I think things like that are really important. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I think that we're ending exactly on time if I look at, well, practically. Chase and Brennan and also Heron, thank you for joining us. Also, Lavender Law is happening this weekend, or just at the same time. And so the fact that you guys made space is something that I'm really grateful for. Make sure that you go to translash.org to sign up for our podcast. And this is something that we're going to be doing more and more on. So, follow our work. And of course, follow everyone on our panel who talk about this all the time. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thanks, Amara.
You.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to see you guys.
You too.